Great privilege to have our speaker, who is Professor Nathan Davies. He is a professor of biochemistry and director of education at the UCL Division of Medicine. He's a registered nutritionist and director of the BSc and MSc Masters Clinical Nutrition programs. He's a noted expert in liver disease and nutrition research, and his research basically is focused on liver disease and how patients change from a stable condition to requiring intensive care. And along the way, he's been able to design and implement novel treatments to prevent this condition. So thank you very much, Professor Davies, and to all of you, thank you for being here today. Please make sure to use the chat. I will be monitoring the chat, and please ask any questions you want to Professor Davies. At the end of the lecture, we will go through a Q&A session. So please write as many questions as you want. So Professor Davies, thank you very much for being here with us today, and I'll pass it on to you.
So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today. So we're going to talk about Christmas dinner, what it involves, and actually we're going to look through the whole day to see what we all like and what we have as part of our Christmas Day diet. So Christmas Day is an incredibly special day for most people. It's a fantastic opportunity to bring the family together. And the center point of Christmas Day for many people is Christmas dinner and the meals and the food that we all share. And you can guarantee that if you get this wrong, this is a disaster. You'll be remembered and talked about for years. But for most people, this is sort of a highlight of the year and it's the most anticipated meal for most people as we look through the calendar. So it's a really sort of special time, and we really do take the opportunity to celebrate it and to celebrate each other while we're having our Christmas Day. So what do we normally have? What does the nation think that we have in our Christmas dinner? So I've gone to a number of sources, and all of these media outlets and organizations have published surveys or studies or questionnaires to say what people like to have for their Christmas Day menu. So what I'm going to show you today is not necessarily what I would choose or even what you might particularly choose, but in general, what surveys suggest that most people like to have. So we'll start at the beginning and we'll go with breakfast. And a lot of this information comes from the Huffington Post. They conducted a survey and they got their readers to write in and say what they preferred to have and what their sort of special Christmas breakfasts were. Now, smoked salmon really turned out to be a really popular choice with a lot of people. So I've included some options here, and we're going to work through some different options and see what these would contribute to our daily diet. And let's start with a sort of a classic here. So here we've got a smoked salmon and cream cheese bagel. If you were to have that as a popular choice, this would give you a starting point of around about 390, 400 calories for the day. All of these figures are give or take a little bit depending on the size and what you have. Another popular choice with a lot of people is this, which is to have smoked salmon and scrambled eggs. A lot of people responded to the survey saying that this was their favorite, this was the best way to start Christmas. If you were to have that, then you come in a shade under about 600 calories. But there's lots of other things and lots of other suggestions that people would say is the best way to start Christmas. Very popular one is to go for the full fry-up. Now, I can appreciate that for a lot of people, this might seem a bit heavy, especially at Christmas when you're looking forward to everything else in that day. But again, a lot of people say this is the best way to start. If you were to go with the sort of full breakfast fry-up, and just looking at what people suggested they would have, if we included bacon, sausages, fried eggs, black pudding, baked beans, toast, butter, ketchup, with a mug of tea, that would give you something in the region of around about 1,100 calories. Now that's quite a lot, particularly as that would contain around about 24.8 grams of your saturated fat. Now, all of the figures we're looking at today are going to be based on sort of an average sort of male diet, and the figures and the recommendations we'll talk about are also relative to sort of the average man. So obviously bigger, smaller, that would make a bit of a difference. But just to say that in this one meal, you would overtake your recommended saturated fat levels for the day. A lot of people prefer to go a little bit simpler, still keep that sort of fried element going with a simple bacon sandwich. If we were to go for a bacon sandwich, this is a bit lighter. This comes in only about 450 calories. However, this is still including a fairly impressive nearly 12 grams of saturated fat. There were some other quite strange suggestions of what would be the ideal Christmas breakfast. Some people wrote in and suggested that a pork pie and mustard was the best way to go for breakfast. Can't quite see that one for myself. And this was a suggestion I found a little bit strange, was to have half a bottle of Irish cream liqueur and half a packet of chocolate finger biscuits. This would give you about just over 1,000 calories for the Irish liqueur and another 350 calories for the chocolate biscuits. Probably not one for the really health conscious amongst you, especially as this would also cram in nearly 40 grams of saturated fat and over 90 grams of sugar. So not for everyone, but if this is your choice for Christmas, well, good luck to you. So let's think about what we're going to include in our menu, and I'm going to put this calorie counter at the bottom, and as we include things throughout the course of the day, we're going to top them up there, and so you can keep a running total of what the calories would be. So I'm suggesting that, again, this was a popular choice in the surveys, a slightly lighter continental perhaps style breakfast, a couple of croissants, maybe with some jam, and a couple of cups of tea or coffee to start the day. If you were to have this would bring in around about 500 calories for the croissants, another 120 for the jam. Tea, coffee with a splash of milk in, doesn't matter too much. You would be only around about sort of 34 calories. So if we can add all these in, we include them in our calorie counter, that starts us off with about 670 calories for the day. While we're thinking about saturated fat, croissants aren't too good. They're not really considered a health food, and these will include over 20 grams, and that's largely because there's a fair amount of butter in that pastry. Moving on. So between Christmas and the main event, which is Christmas dinner, quite often people are engaged in opening presents, having a lovely time. But also people are quite tempted, and again, this is something we see in the surveys, that people like to sort of dip in, have those sort of Christmas treats. So we've got here a popular brand of sort of Christmas chocolates everyone's going to be familiar with. And I put on here that perhaps people would have, say, 4 servings over the course of the morning between breakfast and getting settled down for that sort of main Christmas dinner. Now, I put servings on here rather than chocolates because it does depend on what you go for. If you were to have these type of sweets, well, 2 of these sweets would cost you 1 serving. But if you would have other things, chocolate oranges or the sort of Swiss Toblerone type chocolate, usually it's 1 piece there or a couple of segments. So it's a little hard to actually line them up and get exactly the same when you consider sort of like-for-like comparisons. So I've gone with what the manufacturers call servings. I suggested that maybe you might have 4 over the course of the morning. If you were to do that, that would bring in an additional 350 calories. So let's pop that in the total and see where we've got to. So you can see that we're just over sort of 1,000 calories now as we're heading in towards lunch itself. So we're going to start with starters. What else? And I know a lot of people don't go for starters, but I wanted to put this back in here because a lot of people do, and I also wanted to reintroduce some salmon back into the menu. It was a very popular choice at breakfast, but obviously haven't included there, and quite likely you wouldn't have 2 salmon meals over the course of the day. The reason I put this in is actually because there's some great stuff in here for you nutritionally. So just a standard portion of salmon, which is only about 50 grams. So if you think that the packets that people sell, that the supermarkets sell, usually about 100 grams, so about half a packet per person, you would get 100% of your vitamin D. The vitamin D has been in the news a lot lately. You might have sort of seen this. There have been some suggestions that it could be effective for people not contracting illnesses such as the COVID virus. Evidence would say it's a bit mixed on that, but there's no doubt that most people are vitamin D deficient, and this is a great way to get all the vitamin D you need in a single portion. Also particularly rich in other vitamins, vitamin Bs that we see here, B1, B3, B6, and you're getting around about nearly 3/4 of the requirement you'd have every day for your vitamin B12. What does that give us though? So the smoked salmon, single slice of wholemeal bread, just a bit of dressing on there, simple starter. That would add another 360 calories. We can pop that again into our total. So now moving on to the main meal. This is a really important part. First of all, want to get you to consider roast potatoes. Why consider roast potatoes? Well, the main reason is that the surveys that Which conducted and Good Housekeeping have both determined that roast potatoes are the most important part of the Christmas meal for most people. So this is the bit that I think most people want to get right. And you can't really watch a television program or a cooking show at the moment without some celebrity chef or other talking about how the best way to prepare your roast potatoes for your Christmas dinner are. Lots of them have very elaborate routines. They involve pre-cooking, parboiling, mixing, shaking up, all that type of thing in order to get the perfect crispy roast potato. And they will usually talk very specifically about the types of oils or fats you have to cook them in. Now the question is, does it make a difference nutritionally as to how the potatoes come out? Well, if we consider the various fats that are typically used, starting with sunflower oil, working our way down through olive oil, goose fat, duck fat, butter and beef dripping, actually, for the most part, the calories don't change dramatically. So this is based on what's considered to be a standard portion of roast potatoes, which is 160 grams. It's not a particularly large portion. If you consider that the average size potato, something about the size of your fist, would usually come in between 200 250 grams. You're looking at maybe half, 2/3 of a sort of normal-ish size potato. That's the sort of portion size we're looking at. Calorie-wise, does make a huge amount of difference depending on what type of fat you choose for, unless you go with olive oil, which then brings around quite a bit lower. The interesting thing is you look down the right-hand side, the saturated fat levels, and you can see that the ones that are quite often recommended by the chefs, so the goose fat and the duck fat, tend to be quite a bit higher. And if you go all the way down to the bottom of that table and look and see what sort of the beef dripping figures are, you can see both the calories and the saturated fats are considerably higher than the rest. Perhaps that's one to avoid. The other thing to talk about, and this comes up in the media quite often, and it was quite a lot made 3 or 4 years ago, about whether cooking your roast potatoes and similar things to the point where they saw that sort of dark brown color was going to give you cancer. And this relates to the fact that when you cook potatoes, particularly when you cook them at high temperatures, they get that sort of darker brown color. There's a chemical called acrylamide that sort of develops. And the longer you cook them, the darker they get, then the more acrylamide that's present. And acrylamide has been identified as potentially being carcinogenic. Still very, very small amounts, even in the sort of the darkest cooked potatoes. But the idea is it is something that you do routinely, the chances are that you get some cumulative effect. There are certain things you can do to reduce the amount of acrylamide that forms. One thing is that you should store your potatoes somewhere cool and not put them in the fridge, because put them in the fridge, they get colder, they make more of the chemicals that turn into acrylamide. And also it's suggested that you sort of soak them before you cook them. And if you do that, it also dilutes and some chemicals wash away. General advice, and when you look at sort of the food standards agency, they suggest that you don't go for anything darker than you see in this picture, sort of light golden color. And if that's something that you're happy with, then perhaps that's a good way to go. Right, on to the main meal itself. So here we have the main meal, and I've included in the things that have appeared in the Which survey and in the Good Housekeeping survey as items that the nation says are its favourites. So in terms of the list of things that people particularly like, turkey, gammon, pigs in blankets, parsnips, roast potatoes, stuffing peas, carrots, sprouts, gravy and cranberry sauce, all there in the sort of the top list of things that people want to see. There is something else that occurs in these surveys as well that I can't quite bring myself to agree with. Perhaps it's time to take a stand and say that no, it doesn't really have a place, and that's the Yorkshire pudding. Now, I might be controversial here, but I can't see that Yorkshire pudding belongs on Christmas dinner, even though I know that I'm going against the tide of public opinion. So I haven't put it in today. If it's something that you do include on a regular basis, well, perhaps something you can add on yourselves a bit later. If you were to have this sort of list of Christmas classics, this would bring in your total for the meal at a little over 1,153 calories. Now, it must be said, this again is done with what are considered sort of standard portions, which are usually sort of quite small, actually. I mean, you're looking at sort of tablespoons for the vegetables and moderate amounts for the meats and potatoes, pasta, that type of thing. What we tend to find is that quite often there is more selection of foods available for things like Christmas meals. And people quite often put what they would normally have as a portion on, but have more of these portions. So that might even be a slight underestimate, but that's something that we can't really sort of work out at the moment. If you weren't eating meat and you were vegetarian, as a lot of people are now, then you might want to drop the turkey, gammon, pigs in blanket and substitute that with, this here is an example of a nut roast from one of the sort of major supermarket chains. If you do that, the calorie content comes down a little bit, but that's more about sort of portion size, and that the recommended portion size for the nut loaf doesn't quite replace the portions that we saw for turkey, gammon, and the sort of sausages. If you were to add a bit more to make up for that, or if you were to include some sort of vegetarian alternative versions of the sort of sausage components, you'd very quickly make the calories back up to that of the sort of the meat-based dinner, maybe even a few more, because quite a lot of these sort of vegetarian alternatives tend to be sort of quite heavy in sort of fat content. But that's what we are. That's what we're considering for the sort of Christmas dinner itself. So let's add that to our total and see where we're up to. So now we're a little over 2,500 calories. That's the calorie recommended total for the average man. But we still need to consider dessert, so let's think about that next. But before we get there, I want to take a moment to consider Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts are unequivocally a superfood. You can't get away from this. They are high in vitamins C, K, B9, B6, A, B3. Considering vitamin C, there's more vitamin C gram per gram in sprouts than there are in oranges. They're high in fiber, they're low in calorie, but what makes them particularly special, here's our super sprout, what makes them particularly special is they're high in concentrations of these chemicals that are called glucosinolates. Now, these chemicals they're in all the family that sprouts belong to, so things like broccoli, cauliflower, kale, all those vegetables have relatively high levels as well, but there's more concentration in sprouts than there are in the rest of them. So sprouts really are packed full of goodness in this way. These are so important because they've been identified in lots of studies now to have anti-cancer properties. They're anti-carcinogenic, anti-mutagenic. They've also been shown recently to be protective of cardiovascular disease, and new studies are also showing that they're protective against neurodegenerative diseases. So in that way, they are far and away possibly the healthiest thing you're going to have on the day. However, we do run into the problem that people say, I hate sprouts, I can't eat sprouts, don't like sprouts. Often we hear the excuse as well, don't like sprouts, it's genetic. And that's only sort of partially true. So there is a particular taste receptor, and there's a couple of variants of it in the population, catchily titled TAS2R28. Now, if you have one version of this, you don't taste the bitterness of sprouts at all. If you have the other version of it, then you'll have a sort of heightened sensitivity, and the bitterness present in sprouts is really apparent to you. And actually, that bitterness comes from these GSL compounds. Now, it's not to say that you have to hate sprouts just because you can taste the bitterness. In fact, if you think about it, there's lots and lots of bitter foods that actually we all quite like. And we generally have to train ourselves to quite like them. An example of this is coffee. Coffee's got a bitter flavour. If you think about it, small children don't generally like coffee. It's an acquired taste, but we really sort of come to love it. And the same can be true about sprouts as well. The other thing is the way you prepare sprouts can be really quite important, because when you cook them, you cause these GSLs to break down, and that increases the concentration of the breakdown products, which are more bitter and you have more of them. So if you don't cook the sprouts as much, particularly overcooked sprouts can be really quite bitter. If you don't cook the sprouts so much and keep them that way, then actually, most people will find them quite palatable. There's lots of recipes around for this. In fact, there's a great recipe on the Diabetes UK website, and I recommend trying that one. The suggestion there is you cook the sprouts first and then drop them into cold water, stop the cooking, and then you don't get that sort of bitter flavour. And if you haven't tried sprouts for a while, seriously recommend giving it a go. Back to the main meal, we'll think about dessert. Well, there's lots of options here. We could look at, Christmas chocolate rolls, trifles, all that type of thing. But I've decided to go with the sort of the classic Christmas pudding here. So if you have the classic Christmas pudding, that's going to give you around about 300, a little over 300 calories for a moderate sized portion. And then on top of that, you can add something like cream or custard, which is going to give you more calories on top of that as well. If you decide to go with custard rather than cream, it doesn't make a massive amount of difference. You would reduce the amount of fat, but you tend to increase the amount of sugar. So all in all, it's much of a muchness really. But let's add those in and see where we're up to on our total. Just creeping over the 3,000 calorie mark now. And we haven't quite finished yet. So if you're sitting down then in the afternoon, temptation is maybe to have a few snacks, especially if you're going to sit down, watch Queen's Speech. What might you reach for? Well, you might be thinking about something sort of Christmas staples. Here we've got the sort of dried fruit and nut mix. Here we've got some chocolate raisins, and maybe it's time for a cup of coffee. If you were to have that, for a smallish handful of mixed fruit and nuts, you could add on another 195 calories. A small handful of chocolate raisins would give you another 125, and then coffee with a splash of milk in there. It's not very much at all, maybe another 18. So let's add those in for nibbles while we're watching TV in the afternoon. Let's stop again a moment and just think about that, because nuts are really quite important. There's a lot of really great nutrition in nuts, and we don't tend to eat them as much as we used to. It used to be the fact that Christmas Day the nut bowl would be a sort of iconic thing. It would be there every year, really quite associated with Christmas and festivities. Not so many people seem to do that these days, and it's a bit of a shame. That's because nuts are absolutely packed full of great stuff. They're full of vitamins. You see almonds here, full of vitamins E, B7, B2, but they're really good for minerals. As you can see here, almonds, they've got magnesium, copper, manganese, potassium, cashews. They've also got manganese, copper, but they're also really good for iron as well. They've also got potassium, and they've got some selenium. We'll come back to that one in a moment. Hazelnuts, again, good levels of vitamins, also good levels of minerals, but the best, the most nutrient packed by far are Brazil nuts. So Brazil nuts have higher levels of vitamins, particularly vitamin E, than the other nuts, and you can get your daily recommended level without eating too many. And they're full of minerals as well. So in addition to copper, manganese, potassium, iron, calcium, zinc, there's some phosphate in there. They're especially high in selenium. Now, selenium is very important for your antioxidant defense system. It's great if you're fighting off things like cold. It's really important in sort of maintaining your body's health. And we don't get enough of it. Most people don't eat nearly enough selenium. And there's enough in just 4 Brazil nuts to get to your daily level. So if you are thinking about having a few nuts around at Christmas, certainly make sure you put a few Brazil nuts in the bowl as well. If we get through to Christmas evening, what might we have then? Well, we probably don't want a full meal again, although the survey again suggests that turkey sandwiches in the evening are a must-have for a lot of people. Haven't decided to go there. We just decided, well, maybe we'll bring the cheese board out. So relatively modest, 3 different types of cheeses, maybe a little pate, some crackers, some grapes. That would add on another 850-ish calories. We can't go through Christmas without adding in a mince pie. So let's put that in as well. That gives us another 229. And maybe to round off the whole thing, we'd have a few of the wafer thin mince. 3 of those would give us another 109 calories. Adding all together, that brings us to about a little over 4,500. After that, we might want a few more treats in the evening, whether you're going to sit down, watch a Christmas movie, perhaps play some board games, do something else with the family. It's quite tempting to pass around the Christmas treats. And if you were to go for the chocolates again, we've got another well-known brand here. Now, if you were to work your way through the box and just try, something of everything over the course of a couple of hours, you could very easily add in another 500 or so calories. And the difficult thing about this is that you don't tend to think about it. I mean, things like these treats, these add-ons, these extras, if you ask people the next day, what did you have for Christmas? They wouldn't even really register. They don't sort of feature in your thought processes of what it is that you're eating during the day. So there we are, our total Christmas day, eating through breakfast, treats, Christmas dinner, something in the evening as well, with a few snacks in between, brings us a little over 5,000 calories. But what we haven't included here, and again, this is a bit of a blind spot when you ask people to complete food surveys, it's what they drink. So if we consider what, again, the surveys have suggested that people would drink throughout Christmas Day, a lot of people like to start the day with a glass of something bubbly, some champagne, Prosecco, Cava, that type of thing. A glass of that, standard size measure, gives you about 150 calories. Quite often, starters and Christmas dinner might have another glass. That will give you another 150 calories. And then it seems that the sort of average consumption is about 2 glasses of wine through the rest of Christmas dinner. It must be said that when we're considering here, we are talking about home measures for drinks. We're not talking about things that you would get in restaurants, bars, that sort of thing, where they're a little bit more closely calibrated. While you sat down in the afternoon, again, perhaps watching the Queen's speech, you might be tempted to have a small sherry or maybe a glass of port as a Christmas tradition. And then as you go into the evening, maybe another glass of wine with the cheeser later on. And then perhaps consider at the end of the evening rounding off with a spirit or something a little bit more luxurious. Again, considering that home measures are about twice that you would normally get in a pub or a restaurant. If we total all this together, it comes out at around about 10 alcohol units. You consider that your recommended level for the week is currently about 14. That's a fair old chunk of it. You might look at this and think that's a lot. On the other hand, quite a lot of other people might look at it and think, well, actually, we go through more than that at Christmas. Again, very much dependent on the individual. We're just looking here to see what people suggest that they consume. But if we add those in as well, that's going to give us a little over now 6,000 calories for the day. So again, if you think that the average consumption requirements for the average sized man are about 2,500, then you can see we've gone quite a bit over that. Let's look at some of the other nutritional characteristics of the day. So let's look at the bad to start with. So if we consider that we work our way down and we look at the recommended or the target levels for fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, carbohydrate, sugar, particularly free sugars, the actual consumption, what I've shown you, is considerably more than that in most cases. 3 times the amount of fat, nearly 6 times the amount of saturated fats, 500 as opposed to 300 milligrams of cholesterol. A lot more protein, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but considerably more sugar, about 5 times the amount of recommended sugar, and nearly double the amount of free sugars that are suggested that should be consumed. On the plus point, we can look down the minerals. Iron is nearly double the target value. And that's a great thing because a lot of people in the UK are still iron deficient. So actually getting the iron levels up, that's a really good thing. Good levels of zinc, manganese, and selenium. All of these really important, again, for your defensive systems, your antioxidant defenses, and fighting off disease. Iodine is important. We're just about where we should be on the iodine target. Again, a lot of the UK population is iodine deficient. Particularly, that's a problem in young women. More magnesium than we need, that's a good thing as well. Too much sodium, too much salt, that's a bit of a negative on the day. If we look at the vitamins, actually we see that these are great. So more than we need in pretty much everything. The actual target level of vitamin D, and that's almost entirely down to that portion of smoked salmon that we had at the starter. Most other things we are above the target level, particularly down there, right at the bottom of the list, vitamin B12, that's another one that we really want to see people consuming. So all in all, big ticks all around for the vitamin consumption. So when we're considering, good points, bad points about the day, well, obviously there are more calories than we'd like, and more sort of fats and sugars, but definite pluses in terms of the minerals and vitamin intake. It's got to be said that there have been suggestions that your Christmas dinner itself is enough to get your 5-a-day fruit and veg portions. It's not unless you really decide to sort of pile those on with extra spoonfuls. So one last thing to consider, and this is just a little bit of fun at the end really, and this comes up quite often. How many calories does Santa eat, and could we work this out? So a quick look at the figures. There are 19.2 million households with children in the UK. If every one of those households were to provide Father Christmas with a mince pie, and we're not talking about sort of the standard mince pies here, I mean, Father Christmas deserves the luxury ones, that comes out around about 258 kilocalories per pie. So 19.2 million pies gives us a total of nearly 5 billion calories, which is quite a lot. Now, how long would it take to work that off? Well, if you're running at a fairly sort of good pace, that gives you about 17 calories a minute, and you're running to burn them off at a pace of about 8 minutes per mile. That gives you a total of 136 calories per mile to burn up those calories. So that requires you to run around about 36.5 million miles. If we consider that the equator is a little bit under 25,000 miles, then you'd have to run around 1,460-ish times, which comes in about 4 circuits a day for a year. However, saying that, there's a recent calculation by NASA that said in order to get around all the households, Father Christmas needs to actually travel at 1,800 miles per second. So perhaps we can work out that his calorie usage is quite a bit higher than that of the average person, and he probably gets through them. So that's it. I'd like to say thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and hopefully you found some of that interesting and not too shocking. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Davies. That's been really inspiring, but definitely very frightening and worrying numbers you gave us. So something to keep in mind next time we do our Christmas dinner. So, and thank you everyone for joining us. We have approximately 200 attendees, which is a really good number considering it's late and we're coming near the Christmas season. So I'm pretty sure most of you are already probably traveling, and so I'm really happy to see that you're still here with us. We have some really interesting questions and we have some time for it, so if you don't mind, we're just gonna go through a few of the questions. So question number 1, why are calories so important? Team Inspector argues that they are not, and that gut bacteria is more important, so why do you disagree?
So I think there's lots of things that are important, but there's a simple requirement that we have every day for energy. We have what's called a basal metabolic rate, which is the energy we need to keep our hearts pumping, to keep our brains working, to be able to do even just the very simple metabolic functions and move around. So we can't get away from the fact that we need an amount of energy in order to fuel this. And after this point, the calories that we have the calories we need are dependent on what we're doing. So we have very active lifestyles, we use more calories. If we have quite sedentary lifestyles, then having those extra calories would mean that we start to accumulate sort of weight. And we're all very conscious of the fact now that Body weight's important. It's a big predictor for any number of diseases, from heart diseases, cancer, diabetes, all that type of thing. So we can't get away from that. Now, the gut microbiome is also important. The way we metabolize food is influenced by the bacteria in our gut, and we're in a very definite relationship with our bacteria. We can't get away from that. But I think what we should consider is that the gut microbiome sort of influences perhaps the way that we metabolize food, but still it doesn't fundamentally change the amount of energy that we take in and what our bodies do with it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really important concept. Okay, next question. Do keto diets are very popular these days, do they work more effectively than other diets, such as low-carb diets, which are often marketed?
So there's an awful lot of keto diets, and a lot of them, we would group into sort of fad diets. So if you consider things like the paleo diet or that type of thing, I can't say they don't work. What we tend to what the studies show is that any diet that people embark on causes you to lose weight. Any low-calorie diet, and the keto diets as well, they do cause people to consume fewer calories, and they all work, at least in the short term. The interesting thing is about how many of these diets are sustainable and how many work in the longer term, and most of them are not very successful at that. Quite often they're not very successful because they tend to be quite restrictive, and people basically just get a bit fed up with the lack of choice that they have in the diet. There are keto diets that are used for other specific variants on this, which people use to treat epilepsy and to manage other conditions, but those are not targeted to be in low calorie. Those are instead about managing specific symptoms. So what I would say is that any diet, if you stick to it, works, but most people don't stick to them long enough in order to have, a prolonged effect.
Exactly, I think that's the main problem, maintenance. Coming back to the calorie questions, so I think the same person is asking, do you think calorie counting is really an effective way of tracking energy, as it does not account for the type of food you are consuming?
I think there's an element of truth in that. Calorie counting is difficult anyway. If you think about the mainstream diet companies, things like Weight Watchers and the rest of it, they have over the years tried various different things. They work with calorie counting, then they switched to points-based systems, and all sorts of variants of that. The reason that they don't tend to stick with them is, again, just because of the complexity in it. And also people, as I pointed out when I was going through the sort of talk today, people do tend to have blind spots. So it's all very well to plan ahead and to think, okay, I will have this meal and it will be a sandwich and a cup of coffee and whatever, and that will have this many calories. But the things that they omit would be, I don't know, snacks that they pick up or what they, drinks they have and all that type of stuff. So in order to work, it has to be, someone has to be really quite faithful to the method. So it's not particularly effective for everybody. The other thing that tends to go wrong with this is people tend to be really quite poor at estimating portion sizes. So if I were to say to you or to anybody, okay, so let's say, for example, you had 100 grams of sprouts, carrots, whatever, and I ask you to picture how many sprouts 100 grams were, you would find it really quite difficult unless you actually were there with weighing scales and being able to sort of measure it out. Most people would struggle in that respect. So for most people, it's easier to use simplified systems and to focus on food types rather than trying to be specific about the sort of the calorie content of meals.
Yeah. Interesting question here. Is air frying also very popular these days? Is it more healthy than frying foods in fat?
Yes, it is, just because the quantities of fats are lower. So if you, when you immerse foods like potatoes, chips, whatever, into oil, they will soak it up. I mean, they've got a certain sort of sponge-like quality, and they will absorb more oil. Whereas if you put on less and air fry it, then yes, the quantity of oil absorbed is lower, and so the calories are lower as well. So absolutely, and also just say air fryer is great. I mean, they actually sort of bring food up really quite nice, crispy, and it is better for you.
I've never tried them. I'm thinking about buying one actually. So
could be an ideal Christmas present.
Next question is about nutritional benefits of foods such as salmon. Do you think the nutritional benefits outweigh the high calorific values?
Well, I think it depends on where you set your bar at sort of high calorific values. What I would say is that consuming oily fish, it's recommended by the NHS. You should be having at least 1-2 portions of oily fish a week. Benefits that you get from this are things like the omega oils, which have been associated with reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, that type of thing. So there's definite pluses there. They also do tend to be associated with lowering your cholesterol levels. So there's some very definite good points in it. And you don't tend to get these very much in other foods. There are some in nuts and things, but the richest source of them are in the oily fish. So I think provided you balance out the fish with other things, so you don't necessarily have a lot of other oil-rich foods, particularly on the day or in the course of the week, then they're absolutely fine.
Yeah. Okay. This sorry. Okay. There's an interesting question here. Also, all of these things are very trendy. And now, coconut oil. Is it actually healthier than other oils?
The evidence suggests no, not particularly. It tends to have quite high levels of saturates in there. I don't think people really know the long-term effects are, because coconut oil is relatively new to the mainstream. So people are sort of still following it to see what happens. Obviously, it's very popular now as a vegan alternative in cooking and baking to butters and dairy-based fats. But there are a number of claims about its health properties, but I don't think that the evidence suggests that it is particularly better for you. I mean, there are things that it is better to avoid using butter in most cases, because butter has a very high saturated fat content. But whether coconut oil is better than the other alternatives to butter, probably not significantly so.
Yeah. Okay. Next question, kind of related to the fats as well. Do you think certain fats, what do you think about labeling them as healthy and unhealthy fats?
I think that's a difficult thing, because a lot of that is down to branding and marketing rather than the evidence base behind them. There are certain things that are good for you, are identified as being good for you, and these are the type of things that we already mentioned, things like the omega oils and stuff as well. Certainly, there are some foods that have more fat-soluble vitamins in them. So it's not just the fat in isolation; it's also when it's in the food, what other things you get with it. And one of the problems, I think, with a lot of these sort of claims that you see is that it tries to look at one thing in isolation, but also when you consider that food is actually quite a complex mix. A classic example is that all the studies that show that people who have diets that are rich in vitamins have lower instances of cancer and stroke and heart disease and all the rest of it. However, when you try to give people those vitamins as tablets and then see whether they are also similarly protected from heart disease and so on, all those studies come out to be negative. And it's the fact that if you have a diet that's rich in vitamins and minerals, because your diet is healthy and you have lots of fresh fruit and vegetables in there, not to say that you have to have large amounts of them, but a good mix of them, you're hitting your 5 a day and the rest of it, then that's sort of the thing that gives you health and is a good diet, rather than trying to identify specific characteristics to individual components of it. So to say that one thing is particularly, you shouldn't market it as being particularly healthy or label it as being healthy and the other thing is not, all comes down to quantities and also what it's in. So that's not a especially straight answer, but it's the best one I can give.
Mm. And something related to this, another question, why are saturated fats unhealthier?
So this is, well, where to start this? So fats are like long chains of molecules together, and they're considered to be saturated when all of the molecules are full up with being bound to other things. And the problem with those sort of saturated fats is that they're the things that tend to get deposited in your blood vessels. They're the ones that tend to get deposited around your organs. So if you imagine, if you ever look in sort of the butcher shop and you see, parts of animals, the organs, things, all that hard white fat that's caked around, the organs that you see there, those are the sort of saturated fats. So they're more likely to be deposited and they're more likely to cause problems in the body. So the unsaturated fats, particularly the polyunsaturated fats, tend not to be deposited in the same way. And that's why we tend to get more concerned about saturated fats, just simply because they're the ones that are going to cake up, the blood vessels and the organs in the body.
Yeah. Okay. This is a different kind of question. Is it true that not enough selenium in the diet is a risk factor for cancer?
Possibly. So what selenium does is it does several things in the body. But one of the main things that selenium does is that we have what's called oxidant stress and antioxidants. Most of us will have heard of antioxidants before. Chiefly vitamin C has been identified as an antioxidant we should have in our diet every day. What antioxidants do is they prevent damage in the body. So there's a particular enzyme that we have that needs selenium in order to function. And this enzyme has antioxidant properties and is a key part of our defense system from the damage that accumulates every day. So if we don't have enough selenium in our diet, then we don't have enough of this enzyme working to really effectively produce us from this accumulated damage. So that damage is associated with being linked to the development of cancer. So if you go back through the steps and think, well, we have more selenium, we have more protective enzyme, we have less damage accumulates every day, and so if we have less damage, we are at lower risk to cancer.
Yeah, that's true. And now a question about the red wine myth. Is it really is red wine a healthy option to take a glass every day? Is it really healthy?
Unfortunately, no. It has been supposed that drinking red wine is healthy, that there are antioxidants in red wine. There's a particular chemical called resveratrol that people got very excited about a couple of years ago because they were feeding it to mice, and then those mice weren't getting cancer. Unfortunately, in order to get the equivalent amount of resveratrol in red wine that they were feeding to the mice, I think you need to drink about 50 gallons, which is a bit more than you'd actually need or could take in. But also, if you think about it, these chemicals come from grapes, particularly the grape skins. So if you want to get those antioxidant compounds that are good for you, eat the grapes, don't drink the wine. Regrettably, and it is a great shame, but there's been no study that has now shown that drinking alcohol is protective for you.
Yeah,
it tastes nice, but that's as far as it goes.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, this is a really interesting question. How much does cooking food or processing them affect their nutritional value?
Obviously, quite variable. Depends what you're looking at. So mineral levels don't tend to be affected. Although if you think about vegetables, particularly steaming vegetables is better than boiling them, because if you think about when they're boiling water, some of those the good things in the vegetables, like the minerals, can leak out into the water. However, when you steam vegetables, they tend to stay there. So if you're thinking about cooking, then steaming is better than boiling. Some things are heat sensitive, so vitamin C is heat sensitive. If you cook things for longer, then the vitamin C goes down in proportion to the amount of cooking time. On the other hand, actually, a lot of vegetables, you don't extract all the nutrition from them when they're raw. So if you think about it, things like carrots, for example, carrots when they're raw, you can eat them, crunch them all up, but there's still a lot of fiber there, a lot of dietary fiber and the rest of it, and then that tends to protect what's inside them. And so it's quite a lot of work for you to chew them, break them up, and for your body to break them down, and you don't fully extract all the goodness from them. However, after you cook carrots, actually you break down a lot of that sort of cellular structure, you break down a lot of the fiber in there, and actually makes extracting what's in there a lot more straightforward for the body. So one of the reasons that we cook food is actually that we sort of break it down and we make what's in there more available to us. But there are some things that are a little bit more heat sensitive, and actually the concentrations of those are lower in cooked rather than in raw food.
Yeah. Okay. Only 2 questions left. One, more related to the talk. So what would be your recommended Christmas lunch?
Sprouts, more sprouts with a side order of sprouts. I think that the Christmas lunch actually is not particularly it's not particularly a problem in terms of health things. I mean, when you actually look at what's in the Christmas dinner itself, the calorific level is about the same as you'd have in any main meal. You know, that mixture of meat, vegetables, potatoes on the side of it, all the rest of it, is not too dissimilar to any other meal you might want to eat. What gets you at Christmas is, one, the portion size, where people tend to have, you know, extra bits and add on other little bits, and I'll just have one of those as well, that type of thing, and all the things that go around it as well. So if you looked at what we showed in the presentation, you know, a lot of those extra calories in the day were coming from the treats, coming from the nibbles, coming from the extra bits and pieces, and the drinks of wine and all the rest of it you're adding on top. So personally, I think Christmas dinner is fantastic. I love it. It is one of my favorite meal of the year, and I really wouldn't change it anyway.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's my favorite as well. And I think these are all the scientific questions at the moment. As you know, this lecture series, one of the objectives is to show students the amazing research we do here in UCL, and effectively attract them to enroll in one of the really amazing courses we have. One of the courses we have in the programs are nutrition at the undergraduate and postgraduate level. So I have the last question, which is, it says kind of unrelated, but it's perfectly relevant for you being the head of education in the Division of Medicine. Is it hard to get into UCL?
Is it hard? I wouldn't say it's hard. I mean, we have got fairly high requirements for the grades that we want people to see at their A-levels or international baccalaureate and that type of level. But beyond that, we don't have any extra procedures. So other than, you know, the grades, and we want to see personal statements where people express an interest and you know, and a real desire to follow the sort of programs that they're applying for. We don't have any extra exams. We don't have any interview procedures or any special conditions and things like that. So you know, providing that what you're studying at the moment is going well and you're on for good grades, then by all means apply, and you know, it should be pretty straightforward.
Excellent. And definitely, like I said, we need more bright minds. You guys are going to be the future of science here in the UK, so it'll be really great to welcome you in one of our courses in UCL. So there's nothing left for me to do other than thanking Professor Davies for this amazing presentation, and thank you, all of you, for your attendance tonight, for this really interesting questions you've been posting, and also wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Hopefully we'll see you back in the new year. We will restart this series of public lectures, and until then, well, basically have a Merry Christmas, and thank you all for coming.